Life comes at you fast. No one knows this more than the New York Football Giants. More injuries to the wide receiver position, more roster moves made. We break down where Big Blue stands next. Yes, sir. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the newly minted, freshly pressed Brooklyn Nets over on Locked On Nets podcast with my boy Doug Norrie, and yonder there, the season generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
There's nothing worse, Adam, than the phone call that you get midday for any parents that are out there where you just see the daycares calling you on the phone and you're like, oh, they only call you for bad things. They're not calling you to be like, by the way, you should
Kids crushing it.
Yeah, you should see the finger painting that your son just did. It's like you need to pick up your kid's sick, and then your whole day is ruined. That's what yesterday afternoon was. Trying to get back in the swing of things today to talk about the Giants.
You better believe it, man. Just a heads up here. We got some comments on YouTube said we don't need the banter at the top of the show. And I told them right back, you know what? Andy and I do. That's something that we love.
That's more for us than for them. Like, let's just get this right out of the way.
By the way, if I could tell you about another little tangent, take about 15, 20 minutes, but we'll round into it. Now, listen, we wrapped up our episode yesterday, and it was a good one. Felt solid about it. And then, of course, this just seems like the theme for the New York Football Giants. Colin Johnson, see ya. He's out for the year. And Alex Bachman also got injured. Now, obviously, Colin Johnson being done for the year is the biggest component of this. But it just feels like we can't go on a week-to-week basis or a handful of days here without players falling by the wayside for the New York Football Giants. And Andy, when we talk about the wide receiver position, I mentioned that Bachman tweaked a little something. Now, we got some really positive news with Sterling Shepard. That's amazing. But also, still got Kadarius Toney, working his way back from the injury tweaks. We don't know what Darius Slayton is meant to be or maybe now going to be. This position group, literally 36 hours ago, was like, hey, guys, we got a lot happening for us here. And now it feels like it's just, again, back into this uncertainty, which is frustrating from top to bottom here, whether it's injuries or expectations.
So I thought a lot about this in terms of what we were going to speak about today. And the tough part for me is we kind of talk about, as you mentioned yesterday, Colin Johnson looked good, the wide receiver room, where it's at. And the second that Colin Johnson goes down, everyone said it was a terrible, gruesome injury. He hurt his Achilles. He's out for the year. And we'll talk about the corresponding moves the Giants made in a moment.
Yeah.
But it really just shows that it made me think, and it got me sad, actually, Adam, and I don't want to take it down this path, but it's like we talk about how Daniel Jones is finally going to get like his full complement of players around him to see if Daniel Jones is going to be the guy. And then like with that injury, it gives me some like time to reflect, a little self-reflection. And Colin Johnson out with an Achilles. Kadarius Toney was trying to do drills yesterday and was limping because his hamstring was not acting properly. You have Sterling Shepard coming off an Achilles tear, the one that just got Colin Johnson out for the year. And you have Kenny Golladay, who looks like he's injured, even though he's not, and he's out there off to the side. And it makes me think, is this Giants wide receiving core not like very, very razor thin when we actually think about it with the injuries? That's where I initially start.
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, and Sterling Shepard passed his physical, which is really great news. You said we'll talk about those corresponding moves. I'm just going to quickly hit the top there. You said about Daniel Jones, and this is why, and we're not going down this road in this episode, but this is why I say you got to just evaluate who you have with what you got. You can't keep talking about, well, if you had the offensive line in place, or if you had the right wide receivers, or if this player's healthy, if that player's healthy, if Daniel Jones doesn't have his injury, right? Like, this is the NFL. This is what happens. Players get hurt, and that cliche next man up mentality, it applies to not only who's going to be playing for the team, but also how you evaluate who you have on the team, right? No one gets to just say, well, because of, by the way, you can talk about just, let's stay in the wide receiver room. Kenny Golladay doesn't get to say in week 4, well, I'd be performing better if Kadarius Toney wasn't dealing with a hamstring injury, right? Like, you don't get to point somewhere else and say that's why we're having struggles. But to the main topic of razor thin, yeah, and the other side of it is, and let me just highlight these moves that were made here. Jalen Moore off of from Baltimore picked him up off of waivers. Also picked up Bailey Gaither, both actually claimed off of waivers from the Baltimore Ravens. We said Sterling Shepard passed the physical, and Jordan Akins terminated waived veteran for the New York Football Giants. We'll talk about the tight end here as well in this, but look around the league though. I would say there's a lot of wide receivers that are guys, right? Like, they're just guys that are out there. After your number 1 and your number 2, when you feel like you have a pretty concrete idea about what you're entering the season with, it's just guys. Can they fill a need? Can they serve a role? So when you say, are the Giants razor thin at the position? Well, we don't know what's going to happen, but Kenny Golladay is there. We assume Kadarius Toney is just gently nursing himself through it. And then you get into the cast of characters, right? Like, it is what it is. And if Sterling Shepard's going to come back and be on the field, great. And by the way, and Wan'Dale Robinson, right? So no, I don't think they're razor thin. I think the depth is maybe going to be interesting, but tell me another team that when you get to the 4th or 5th wide receiver, you say, oh yeah, that guy, wait until you see him, right? No, every few weeks in an NFL season, you go, wow, player X bubbled up and had a real breakout game based on what the defenses gave you.
Well, and that's the hard part about when we talk about evaluating Daniel Jones. We say he didn't have Saquon Barkley for a lot of the time. Kenny Golladay was hurt. Sterling Shepard was out. But to your point, I'm going to even solidify your point even further. And we didn't talk about this pre-show, Adam, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Ooh.
Name me 3 wide receivers on the Baltimore Ravens today.
Oh yeah, well that stinks too, because I know like Hollywood Brown is gone, and
right.
I've been paying attention to them. So
can you give me one? Give me one wide receiver on the Baltimore Ravens.
Is Bateman still there?
Yeah. So Rashad
did it.
Yes, their high draft pick Rashad Bateman.
Well,
the other 2 starting wide receivers are Devin Duvernay and James Proche II.
Classic.
And then behind them, there's Tylan Wallace and one of our former Giants that made the practice squad, Victor Benjamin. So, like, to your point, like, we just went like 3 or 4 guys deep. We can only name basically one guy on the Baltimore Ravens, and Lamar Jackson's an MVP candidate every year, day in, day out. So, like, we don't give him the benefit of the doubt whether he has the cast of characters. But to me, so the other question that pops up, and I saw a lot of people on Twitter kind of tapping the message, being like, hey, I'm sorry that I said so many bad things about you, but I need you in my life. Let's talk a little bit about Darius Slayton.
Darius.
Doesn't it feel like the second that the Achilles pops are like, well, if you go back to Darius Slayton's rookie year,
so here's the problem,
right? Like,
here's the problem with this, and we're guilty of it, of course, 100% here. But here is the problem. And some people, by the way, on YouTube and stuff, we've seen those comments about, hey, you go back and look at Darius Slayton's rookie year. And I don't even mean now that the injuries have come in. They've said it, throughout the offseason. And we've talked about the combination of talent versus where you are, new regime, final year of the contract, and the financial commitment of $2.5 million. So those things matter in this conversation for Darius Slayton. And also, once Colin Johnson goes down and you have these other injuries happening here, I think you do look at Darius Slayton and you at least have to say, well, we know, and we talked about this before, this dude has NFL reps, right? Even Alex Bachman, say he's 100% healthy coming off the little tweak in practice, he doesn't have NFL reps under his belt, right? He doesn't have 40 plus catches in a year, 8 touchdowns in a season. Like, nobody else on this roster, Richie James included in that, CJ Board, whether he's healthy or not included, like, it doesn't matter. None of these guys can say that they have done what Darius Slayton has done. And by the way, even though we know he's a far better player and a much better talent, Kadarius Toney can't even say that, right? The only guys on there are Kenny Golladay and Sterling Shepard. Those are the guys on the roster that can look at their resume and say, we've done this. So from that standpoint, depending on how things play out here, you at least do have to look back at Darius Slayton now and say, whatever the reward was for us moving on from him and the reward for other younger players on this roster potentially, hey, we may have to live with you walking out of here a year from now for nothing and not maybe pursuing someone else by getting the 2.5 now, because we need the body. And who knows, maybe this is one of those opportunities for Darius Slayton to reestablish what his value is for this team.
But does it change anything really for Darius Slayton? Does it really? Like I know
It
that
doesn't
you're
change
kind of
anything
like,
for him personally. I think he's going to market no matter what. He wants to find a new opportunity, I think. So I don't is his time up with the Giants? Probably, almost certainly, right?
well, I'm saying, it looked like Colin Johnson clearly solidified a roster spot if he was going to be healthy going into the season with his play during
Yeah.
training camp and the preseason games. But like him going down doesn't mean, okay, we're going to put Darius Slayton in his spot and we're just going to continue to move on. I think the Giants'
Oh.
problems, as you mentioned, are still the same. And when we talked about who's going to make the roster from a wide receiver perspective, we're like, oh, will David Sills make it? Will Alex Bachman make it? And depending on Alex Bachman's injury, now you're just going to keep both because the
Yeah,
problem.
but it does change it though, because Colin Johnson was being viewed as a guy who could get Sunday reps for this team.
Sure.
Sills and Bachman, these are guys, but they weren't necessarily, if they don't see the field as you get to the fifth and sixth wide receiver, that's different. Like Richie James, if he was gonna, if he's gonna be healthy and you think about him as being that next level guy, but once Colin Johnson goes down, if it was David Sills, if it was Bachman, even if it was Richie James, it would be looked at differently. Colin Johnson is the size and the capability that you wanted to have on the outside. Even if you get Sterling Shepard back, you're thinking about interior slot receivers, outside receivers. So I think it does change it a little bit because
Well,
he is up the pecking order wherever you thought he was.
but remember, Brian Daboll, when he mentioned that thing of not competing for a roster spot, competing for snaps on Sunday, it
Yeah,
wasn't just about Colin Johnson. He was mentioning David Sills in the same breath. So, like,
yeah, yeah.
there still is the opportunity for Sills to get reps. But what I'm saying is that regardless of Darius Slayton having experience, 2 years of roughly 750 yards receiving is nothing to sneeze at. That is a competent, solid number 3-ish wide receiver in anyone's room.
Right.
The problem is the 2.5 million. Like, he played so well his rookie season that all these escalators came in for his salary, which is ultimately the reason why he's not going to make this roster, because the Giants need that $2.5 million. Because look at what's going on in the tight end room. Look at the linebacking position. There's just so many other areas where you look at it and say, I don't know who's even going to make this roster. Whereas with the wide receiver room, you look at David Sills, you're like, I could competently have you as the last wide receiver on the 53 and know that if we needed you to do 10 snaps, it's fine. We can't say the same thing in other places around the roster.
Yeah, and I think the biggest factor of this is it really to me is Sterling Shepard in a lot of ways, right? If he's coming back and he looks healthy, then you're saying, because to your point about Sills, it's where is the expectation threshold for the fourth wide receiver, right? If it's Galladay and it's Wan'Dale Robinson and it's Kadarius Toney and it's Sterling Shepard, and you have some concerns or questions around the fourth, and I'm not labeling them in a hierarchy, but you have these four guys. If Sills, to your point, well, we just need breather reps. That's different than saying we may need a real player out there. And who knows, it may be the opportunity for David Sills to showcase what he's capable of if that role gets bigger. And from that standpoint, and by the way, I'm willing to go on both sides here, but for me personally, I don't think that Darius Slayton is a long-term piece of this team. There's no reason, I said this about every single time we talk about veterans or otherwise, there's no reason to waste the reps this year unless you think there's a real opportunity for that player. And that could be true, let's say in theory, for a David Sills. Always talks about having a good rapport with Daniel Jones, right? Whatever. If you think you want to Daniel Jones, you're going to evaluate him, maybe that's the guy that you keep on the roster going forward if Daniel Jones ends up being the quarterback. Whereas Darius Slayton, again, contract year, where are we headed ultimately? I don't think even in the best case scenario that Darius Slayton puts up another 750 yards for you and catches a handful of touchdowns. Well, okay, let's pause for a second here because I was going to say I don't think there's any world where he would be back, but maybe you suddenly look at him and knowing what could happen with Kenny Galladay, but he's going to go to market. He's going to go get a contract somewhere else, even in the best case scenario. So I think that's the biggest component to me is evaluating the team, and Darius Slayton is not necessarily in a position to get himself another contract with the Giants almost no matter what he does on the
Well,
field.
it's crazy because I mentioned the Baltimore Ravens with Lamar Jackson. Could the Baltimore Ravens, with that wide receiver room I just mentioned to you, use a guy like Darius Slayton as a number 3 wide receiver? Like, he could
I
fit
just don't
in
know. Yeah, do you think
perfectly there.
does anyone care about Darius Slayton? Like, and we always talk about this, right? Like we and the same thing. These low level guys, and we're talking even David Sills. Does anyone give a crap about David Sills in the NFL? Did anyone care that Alex Bachman, whatever that spectrum of how our players looked at outside of your locker room versus where the league is? Because for 2.5 million, wouldn't we have thought that maybe a team would have already made the move to bring in Darius Slayton? I mean, the Giants can't be asking for more than a back end 6th or 7th round pick for the guy. Why doesn't anybody else want that 2.5 million? You said potential 3rd wide receiver. Like, shouldn't someone have already made that call?
Well, but the thing is, Adam, yeah, does anyone care? I think they do. They don't care enough to give up draft assets and have to pay the 2.5 million. If you could bring him in on a low level $1 million deal, that sounds good. But pay him 2.5 million and give up draft assets to the
Yeah,
Giants.
yeah, that's fair.
You're like, for a 3rd wide receiver or a guy that's a fringe player for us, it doesn't really make sense. When I think about who's going to be here, because I still don't, I just the logistics and the mechanics of Darius Slayton and his contract and where he's at, it doesn't fully make sense to me for him to be on this roster. But the question that I have, and then we could turn it away from the wide receiver room if you want, is isn't it time to see what we have in David Sills and Alex Bachman? Like, they're 26. They've been on the practice squad.
See,
We've been hearing about them
I know, but
for
that's
years. David, you mentioned David Sills practicing all the time with Daniel Jones, making all these plays. They have a great rapport, as you mentioned. It's like, isn't it time to just see if that's going to work or not? Because
that's fine. I'm pro that, but I think the caveat there was the same thing with Colin Johnson, who was 24 years old. Like, you got two 26-year-old wide receivers. Like, you know what I mean? Let's call a spade here, right? Like, these guys would have done something if they were going to do something. It doesn't mean they can't be contributors. It doesn't mean they can't have a flashy season. But by most NFL standards, you do not all of a sudden find your stride at 26 in the NFL, especially, running backs, talk about short shelf life. Like, wide receivers don't, you know what I mean? Like, you don't start your career at 26, 27. By 30, a lot of wide receivers, as we're maybe experiencing with Kenny Golladay, start to see things catch up with them a little bit. So then again, it doesn't mean I don't think they can't have a nice little season for themselves, but I think, like, you already know what they are. This is just about, and we'll end it here, man. This is what this episode's going to be. It's going to be a tight 20 about the wide receiver room and what they're trying to deal with. And these pickups that they got are guys that don't have stat lines for themselves, over the last couple of seasons. What is the better value for the New York Football Giants? Evaluating David Sills and Alex Bachman on the 53-man roster, knowing that they're not a part of the future of this team, or finding a way to hold on to Darius Slayton, who, whether or not he's going to be a part of the future of this team, is an established number 3 and at some points borderline 2 for this team over his rookie contract.
at the end of the day, Adam, what you said is something I can't get on board with, because you said David Sills and Alex Bachman are not part of this team. Like, you basically just said they're not part of the future. And the whole thing that I have to say is, until I see them get a few reps in a meaningful situation, I can't make that statement. I can say for certain to you that Darius Slayton will not be part of the future plans.
I disagree with you. Then hold on. Then I disagree with you at the end of the day, good sir. Because, like, if that's the conversation you're having, hold on, no, hold on.
Who's more likely to be on the roster next year? Darius Slayton?
None of them.
Or David Sills?
But what is it predicated on? Right now, in this moment? Right now, right now, it's more likely in this moment, and we're talking like 53-man roster, that Darius Slayton would be on the roster next year because he's the only guy that's done anything at the NFL level. Like, that is the standard. Now, is that a 4% chance and Bachman and Sills are at a 3% chance? Like, that's fine. But that's my point, is like, no, none of these guys are likely to be a part of this roster going forward. And you can say, well, Sills and Bachman have been around. They'll still be there in camp. Okay, great. But I'm talking about, you have Kadarius Toney, you have Wan'Dale Robinson. When we go into next offseason, it's going to be about, and maybe, Sterling Shepard, even though we hope he's going to be healthy, he's going to be gone. Kenny Golladay, if they can, will be gone. It's going to be about, how do we add into this wide receiver group with another young, talented weapon that we'll draft in the 2nd round next year in the draft class, or go to free agency and find the right complementary player. But who is more likely to be on a starting NFL roster anywhere in the league? It's Darius Slayton before it's going to be Bachman or a Sills. And I know you're saying specifically the Giants, but that, like,
The Giants roster with their salary cap constraints plus their roster construction make it much harder for Darius Slayton to be on this roster when we need the money elsewhere. If you ask me who's a better football player, it's Darius Slayton than either David Sills or Alex Bachman. But unfortunately, the Giants have a completely different issues than other teams. The last thing I will say, Adam, to make it really easy to even further your point, Darius Slayton, his first 2 years, averaged the same amount of yards as Russell Gage did. Russell Gage had about 750 yards. He just signed a 3-year, $30 million deal with the Tampa Bay Bucks, and he's a year older than Darius Slayton. So Darius Slayton has had more touchdowns than Russell Gage at a younger age and had the same yardage. And, here we sit. He can't be afforded for $2.5 million, yet a guy in a similar situation is getting $10 million and going to play with Tom Brady.
And that's my point. The Giants sacrificed a ton in what they had to give up here in the rebuild and the cap constraints. If you didn't move off of Nick Gates sooner with the money and got him to the PUP list, he's going to be afforded every opportunity. And we've talked about this with coaching. We're going to come back in, get us on YouTube. This was a free form episode. We got a lot of things going on today, but if you think that the new coaching staff elevates what Julian Love can be and elevates what all these other guys that are holdovers could be that we maybe thought wouldn't be a part of this, then Darius Slayton has to be put back into that conversation. And I'm just going to be fascinated. We said he put some good tape on there in preseason game number 1, and then they want to save him potentially for a move. I don't know which way it's going to go. I would love if Darius Slayton had a chance to be a part of this team and didn't become one of those cap victims that doesn't afford him the chance to put one more best foot forward in what could be a very dynamic Mike Kafka system, something we haven't seen yet. So if I'm a betting man, I really would hope I would take whatever the probably plus number is to get Darius Slayton to the regular season as a New York Football Giant. We'll come back in. We'll break it all down. There's going to be more moves, more discussions, tight end room, everything else. We will get there. Come back with us as always, OGP. Until next time, as Andy Makowitz wants, needs, and nay demands the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.